In the will reading, the mother left her adopted daughter only a letter. Little did she know. Rebecca Johnson held the yellowed envelope with trembling hands as she watched her siblings receive properties, jewels, and a considerable fortune from the woman she had always called mother. She, who had dedicated the last 10 years of her life caring for Mrs. Margaret, received only a sealed letter. Attorney William Patterson, the family lawyer for over 3 decades, continued reading the will without showing any emotion at the silent tears streaming down Rebecca's face. Across the mahogany table, her sister Jennifer smiled with undisguised satisfaction. "To my daughter Rebecca, who stood by me through my hardest times," the lawyer read in a monotone voice, "I leave this letter, which should only be opened when she is alone." Daniel, the youngest brother, cast a worried glance at Rebecca, but was immediately silenced by the sharp look from Richard, the eldest. "She's already received more than enough over the years," Richard muttered, adjusting his tie with a gesture Rebecca had known since childhood. It was the same move he always made when he wanted to end a conversation. Rebecca felt her world crumbling around her. For 30 years, since she had arrived at that house at the age of 5, she had believed she was loved equally by her adoptive parents. Margaret had always called her "my heart's daughter," but now the truth seemed cruel and crystal clear. She had never truly been part of that family. "The apartment on Maple Street where the young lady currently resides," Attorney William continued, "goes to Mr. Richard Johnson, as specified in item 17 of the will." The news hit like a punch to the gut. Rebecca had lived in that apartment since she was 18, when she had moved out of the main house to study nursing. Margaret had always said it would be hers forever, but now she discovered she didn't even have a place to live. "Attorney William," Daniel said, rising from his leather chair, "there must be some mistake. Mum always said that—" "Daniel," Jennifer cut in coldly, "the will is clear. Rebecca is not a legitimate child of this family. She's already been privileged enough all these years." Rebecca tucked the letter into her bag with shaking hands and left the room without a word. The sound of her heels echoed through the marble hallway of the office, but she could hear nothing over the pounding of her own heart. Walking aimlessly through the streets of Beverly Hills, Rebecca remembered every moment she had shared with Margaret, the sleepless nights during her pneumonia, the baths she gave her mother when she could no longer care for herself, the conversations about old recipes Margaret insisted on teaching her so they wouldn't be forgotten. "How could she do this to me?" she whispered to herself, stopping in front of a clothing store window without really seeing what was displayed. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Her phone rang in her bag. It was Dorothy, the owner of the bakery where Rebecca worked part-time on weekends to supplement her nursing income. "Sweetheart, I heard what happened." Dorothy's warm voice came through the line. "Come here right now." Rebecca found Dorothy waiting at the door of St. Joseph's Bakery in the heart of South Beach. The woman in her 60s hugged her without a word, as if she knew exactly what Rebecca needed at that moment. "You can stay in the back room as long as you need," Dorothy offered, leading Rebecca into the bakery that smelled of fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee. "It's not much, but there's a bed and a small bathroom." "Mrs. Dorothy, I can't accept this. You barely know me and—" "I've known you for 5 years, my dear. I saw you caring for that woman with a tenderness even her own flesh and blood didn't show. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." That night, in the cramped little room at the back of the bakery, Rebecca held the letter against her chest, too afraid to open it. The paper was yellowed at the edges and carried a scent that reminded her of the perfume Mrs. Margaret had always worn, that rose fragrance that clung to all her belongings. 3 days passed, and the letter remained sealed. Rebecca tried to keep up her routine at the hospital where she worked, but her co-workers noticed something had changed. She, who had always been talkative and cheerful, now worked in silence, lost in thoughts no one could decipher. It was on Thursday morning that an elegant lady appeared at the bakery asking for her. Rebecca was arranging the bread in the display case when Dorothy called out to her. "Rebecca, someone's here to see you." The woman must have been around 70. Her graying hair pulled into a low bun, her light blue eyes strangely familiar. She wore a well-tailored beige linen suit and carried a leather purse that spoke of good taste, not extravagance. "Are you Rebecca Johnson?" the stranger asked softly. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something?" "My name is Eleanor Wilson. I was a childhood friend of Grace, your birth mother." The world seemed to stop. Rebecca had always known she was adopted. Mrs. Margaret had never hidden that from her, but she'd never shown any interest in seeking out her origins. To her, Mrs. Margaret was her mother, period. "You knew my birth mother?" Rebecca asked, feeling her legs weaken. "I did. And I need to talk to you about some important things. But first," Eleanor looked straight at Rebecca's bag, "you need to open the letter Mrs. Margaret left you." "How do you know about the letter?" "Because I was there when she wrote it, dear Mrs. Margaret came to me 3 months before she passed. She was very worried about what might happen to you after she was gone." Rebecca's chest tightened. Had Mrs. Margaret known her biological children wouldn't treat her well? Why had she never said anything? Eleanor ordered a coffee and sat at one of the bakery's small tables. Her movements were refined, like someone raised with good manners, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes that Rebecca couldn't ignore. "Your birth mother's name was Grace Wilson. She was my younger cousin and the kindest soul I ever knew," Eleanor began, stirring sugar into her coffee with slow, deliberate motions. "She and Mrs. Margaret were sisters." The words hit like a bomb. Rebecca felt the ground slip from under her. "Sisters? What do you mean, sisters? Mrs. Margaret never told me she had a sister." "Because there was a terrible fight between them over 30 years ago. Grace left town pregnant with you and they never spoke again." "But why? What happened?" Eleanor took a deep breath as if carrying this story was too heavy a burden. "You'll only understand after you open the letter, dear." Mrs. Margaret was very specific. First the letter, then the rest of the story. Rebecca looked at her bag where the letter was kept. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the yellowed envelope. Carefully, she broke the seal that had held it closed for so many days and unfolded a page of handwriting she knew so well. "My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this letter, it's because I couldn't find the courage to tell you the truth while I was alive. You are the daughter of my sister Grace, who left this city 30 years ago, carrying you in her womb and a sorrow in her heart that I could never heal. The coordinates on the back of this letter will lead you to someone who can explain everything. You have until November 15th to find your mother. That was the deadline I set for myself to fix the greatest mistake of my life. I love you as if you were my own daughter, because to me you always were. Margaret." Rebecca turned the paper over and found geographic coordinates written in pencil: 227539, 434371, and a date, November 15th. Only 12 days remained. "That date," said Eleanor, who had read the letter over Rebecca's shoulder, "is very important. Grace is in a retirement home in Montauk. She has an illness that affects her memory, and the doctors say that by the end of the month she might not recognize anyone anymore." "My birth mother is alive?" Rebecca could barely process all the information coming at once. "She is, but time is running out. Margaret found out where she was a few months ago and had been secretly paying for her treatment." "Margaret was paying? With what money?" "With the money that was meant to be your inheritance, dear. That's why her other children always treated her coldly. They knew part of the family fortune was being used to care for Grace. Everything was starting to make sense. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room, the strange looks from Richard and Jennifer, the tension that always lingered at family gatherings. They knew everything and blamed her for a situation she hadn't even been aware of. Why did Margaret never tell me any of this? Because she was afraid you'd leave her to search for Grace, and also because she carried a deep guilt for what happened between them. Eleanor finished her coffee and stood up from the table. "The coordinates will lead you to Mrs. Mabel, the midwife who delivered you and gave you to Margaret. She lives in a simple little house in New Haven. She's the one who can tell you the whole story. Will you come with me?" "No, dear. This is a journey you must make alone. But know that Margaret truly loved you, even while carrying this pain in her heart for so many years." That afternoon, Rebecca took a bus to New Haven. The coordinates led her to a small light blue house on a dirt road, surrounded by a garden full of flowers tended with great care. An elderly woman with white hair was watering the plants when she arrived. "Are you Mrs. Mabel?" The woman looked up and nearly dropped the watering can. "Good heavens! You look just like Grace when she was young," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "You're Rebecca, aren't you?" "Yes, I am. Were you expecting me?" "I've been waiting for 30 years, dear." Mrs. Mabel was 82 years old, and one of those people whose age couldn't dull the spark in their eyes. Her hands, though wrinkled, were steady as she served lemon balm tea on the porch. "Your birth mother, Grace, and Margaret were sisters and best friends," Mrs. Mabel began, settling into a wooden rocking chair, "until they fell in love with the same man." "The same man?" "Richard Carter, a handsome young man who worked at the town clerk's office. Both of them fell head over heels for him when they were in their early 20s. Rebecca shivered. She had never heard Margaret mention that name. Margaret was the eldest and was promised in marriage to Dr. Andrew Johnson, father of Richard, Jennifer, and Daniel. It was an arranged marriage between families, but she accepted because that's how things were done back then. And my birth mother, Grace, was younger and free to choose. When Richard asked her to be his girlfriend, Margaret had to step back, even though she was in love with him. It was the hardest thing she ever had to do. The tea had gone lukewarm, but Rebecca could barely drink. Each revelation was like a puzzle piece clicking into place in her mind. Grace and Richard's relationship lasted 2 years. She was completely devoted, talking about marriage, about starting a family. But then out of nowhere, he vanished from town without explanation. Vanished. He disappeared overnight, left his job at the records office, the boarding house where he lived, everything. Grace was desperate, searched for him everywhere. That's when she found out she was pregnant. Mrs. Mabel stopped rocking in her chair and looked directly at Rebecca. When Margaret learned her sister was expecting Richard's child, she offered to help. But Grace took it as pity and flew into a rage. She accused Margaret of being glad Richard had left. But Margaret was engaged to Dr. Andrew. Yes, but the heart doesn't understand commitments, dear. Margaret had always loved Richard, even though she'd sacrificed for the family. When he left Grace, a part of her hoped he might come back to her. And Grace realized this. Those sisters knew each other better than anyone in the world. Grace saw in Margaret's eyes that she still held hope for Richard. That's when the fight exploded, the one that tore them apart forever. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky a soft orange. Rebecca thought of Margaret, always so kind and patient, carrying that pain in silence for so many years. Grace left New Haven when she was 7 months pregnant, said she wanted nothing more to do with family, that she'd raise the child alone, far from everything that reminded her of her sister's betrayal. Betrayal. She believed Margaret was happy her relationship had ended. She couldn't understand her sister was torn between her love for Richard and her love for her. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Grace went to New York City and found work as a maid for a family. When you were born, she tried to care for you alone, but she was battling severe depression. She couldn't connect with you. How do you know all this? Because she came back here when you were 3 months old, desperate, said she couldn't be a mother, that you cried constantly and she didn't know what to do. She was terribly thin, with deep shadows under her eyes, clearly in no state to care for a child. Mrs. Mabel stood and brought out an old shoebox from inside the house. Margaret had visited me every month since Grace left, always asked if I'd heard from her sister. When Grace showed up here with you in her arms, I knew I had to call Margaret. Margaret came for Grace. She came that same day. Drove straight here and found her sister sitting in that very chair you're in now, holding you and crying. 30 years later, I still haven't forgotten that scene. Mrs. Mabel opened the shoebox and pulled out some old photographs. In the first, 2 young women smiled, arms around each other in front of a church. Rebecca recognized Margaret immediately, but the other girl had her own eyes and smile. "That's your birth mother," Mrs. Mabel said, handing Rebecca the photo. This was taken at a cousin's wedding, a few months before they met Richard. Rebecca held the photo carefully as if it might break. Seeing Grace's face was like looking into a mirror of the past. The resemblance was striking. What happened when Margaret got here? The 2 of them talked all night. I heard crying, arguments, long silences. The next morning, Grace handed you to Margaret and left again, but this time for good. She didn't want to take me. She couldn't, dear. She was too broken emotionally. Margaret promised to raise you as her own, and Grace made her swear never to tell the truth while she was alive. Why? Because Grace was ashamed she couldn't be a mother. I thought you'd be better off not knowing you had a mother who abandoned you. Rebecca looked at the photo again. Grace looked so young, so full of dreams. It was hard to imagine that smiling girl had become a woman who gave up her own daughter. Mrs. Mabel, where is my birth mother now? In a retirement home in Montauk. Margaret found her 2 years ago after decades of searching. Grace was living alone in a small apartment, getting by on a meager pension. She'd developed early dementia and could no longer take care of herself. Margaret went looking for her. She did. But when she got there, Grace didn't recognize her. The disease had already progressed too far. Margaret was devastated, but she decided it was her responsibility to care for her sister, even if Grace didn't know who she was. That's why she was paying for the treatment. Exactly. Margaret sold the family jewelry, dipped into her own savings, everything to make sure Grace had the best care possible. Did Margaret's children find out? Richard found out by chance a year ago when he saw a check from his mother's account to the retirement home. Margaret had to tell part of the truth, but she never revealed that you were Grace's daughter. Do they know I'm Margaret's sister's daughter? They do, and that's why they always treated you coldly. They saw you as an intruder costing the family money. Night had fallen, and the lights in Mrs. Mabel's house cast a warm glow on the porch. Rebecca felt as if her entire life had been rewritten in the last few hours. I have to go to Montauk, Rebecca said, tucking the photo and Margaret's letter into her bag. Yes, you do. But dear, prepare yourself. Grace has moments of clarity, but they're rare. Most of the time she lives in her own world, mixing up the past and present. Even so, I have to try. Of course you do. Margaret left that letter precisely so you could know your full story. And who knows, maybe meeting Grace will bring peace to both of you. Mrs. Mabel walked Rebecca to the gate. The night was starry, and the mountain air carried the scent of garden flowers. One last thing, the older woman said, gently holding Rebecca's arm. Margaret asked me to give this to you if you ever came here. She handed over a small, aged envelope. What is it? A photo of you as a baby, in Grace's arms. It's the only picture of the two of you together. Rebecca carefully opened the envelope and found a small black and white photo. A thin, sad-eyed young woman held a baby in her lap. Despite the melancholy expression, the love in Grace's eyes as she looked at her daughter was unmistakable. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Mabel. Nothing to thank me for, dear. Now go meet your mother. Time is running out. The next morning, Rebecca took the first bus to Montauk. Peaceful Haven Retirement Home was nestled in a wooded area of town, a place that breathed tranquility, but also carried a sadness she felt the moment she arrived. The head nurse, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, greeted her at the reception. Are you a relative of Mrs. Grace? The nurse asked, checking a clipboard. I'm her daughter. Oh, how wonderful. She hasn't had visitors in so long. Mrs. Margaret used to come often, but she passed away a few weeks ago, didn't she? Yes, she did. Grace was very upset, you know. Even with her confusion, she always calmed down when Margaret visited. She'd say she remembered a sister from her childhood. Rebecca's heart clenched. Even in her illness, Grace still held some memory of Margaret. Is she lucid today? She's having a better day. She ate breakfast, chatted a bit with the other residents. But dear, prepare yourself. She might not recognize you or could confuse you with someone else. Rebecca followed the nurse down a bright, quiet hallway until they reached an inner garden where a few patients were enjoying the morning sun. In a wheelchair, facing away from her, sat a woman with grey hair gazing at a rose bed. Grace, you have a visitor, the nurse said softly. The woman turned the chair slowly, and Rebecca felt her legs weaken. Even with a face marked by age and illness, it was impossible not to recognize her own features in that face. It was like looking at herself 40 years from now. Hello, Grace said in a weak but sweet voice. Have you come to visit me? Yes, I have. My name is Rebecca." "Rebecca," Grace repeated as if testing the name. "That's a beautiful name. You remind me of someone, but I can't remember who." Rebecca knelt beside the wheelchair, bringing herself to Grace's eye level. "May I stay here with you for a while?" "Of course, dear. You seem like a good person. You have kind eyes like Margaret's. Do you remember Margaret?" "Margaret?" Grace closed her eyes for a moment. "Margaret was my sister. We were very close as children. We played together, shared secrets. But something happened. I can't quite remember." "Did you have a fight?" "A terrible fight. Over a man, I think." Grace opened her eyes and looked directly at Rebecca. "You have his eyes." "Whose?" "The man who made me suffer. Richard. Richard something. He left me alone. Alone and pregnant." Rebecca's heart raced. Grace was remembering. "Did you have a baby?" "I did. A beautiful girl. But I couldn't be a mother to her." Tears began to stream down Grace's face. "I gave her to Margaret. Margaret was always better than me at everything. Do you regret it?" "Every single day of my life. I dream about her, you know. I dream she comes looking for me and forgives me for being such a terrible mother." Rebecca took Grace's hand, which was cold and trembling. "If your daughter showed up here today, what would you say to her?" "I'd tell her that I never stopped loving her, that not a day goes by without me thinking of her, that giving her to Margaret was the hardest decision of my life, but I knew she'd be a better mother than I ever could be. And if she said she doesn't hold any grudges against you, that would be impossible. A mother who abandons her child doesn't deserve forgiveness." Rebecca took a deep breath, sensing the moment had come. "Mom," she said softly, "I'm Rebecca Johnson. I'm your daughter." Grace fell silent for a long moment, staring at Rebecca. Her eyes filled with tears, and her hands trembled even more. You're my Rebecca?" "Yes, I am. But you called me Mom. I don't deserve to be called Mom." "Yes, you do. You gave me life and Margaret gave me love. Both of you are important to me." Grace let out a deep sob, as if releasing 30 years of pent-up pain. Rebecca hugged her, feeling her mother's fragile body shake in her arms. "Can you forgive me?" Grace whispered. "I forgave you a long time ago, even before I knew I needed to forgive." They held each other for several minutes before Grace pulled back and cupped Rebecca's face in her hands. "You're so beautiful, so much like me when I was young, and you have Margaret's kind eyes. Would you like me to tell you about my life? I want to know everything, every detail." Rebecca spent the rest of the morning recounting her childhood in the Johnson household, her nursing career, and the love Margaret had always shown her. Grace listened intently, asking questions and smiling at every story. "Margaret was a wonderful mother to you," Grace said when Rebecca finished. "That's exactly what I hoped for when I gave you to her. You never regretted it, did you, giving you to her? Never. Fighting with my sister, every single day. I should have looked for Margaret years ago. I should have asked for forgiveness." "Margaret came to visit you here." "She did?" Grace seemed confused for a moment. "I sometimes feel like someone familiar comes to see me, but I can't remember clearly. She came every week. It was Margaret who paid for your treatment here." Grace covered her face with her hands and cried again. "She took care of you, and still took care of me, even after everything I did. Because she loved you, you two loved each other despite the fight. I lost so much time wasted because of pride." At that moment, the nurse appeared to say it was time for Grace's lunch. Rebecca promised to come back the next day. "Will you really come back?" Grace asked, holding her daughter's hand. "I'll come back every day I can. What if I don't remember you tomorrow? I'll introduce myself again and tell our story as many times as I need to." Grace smiled for the first time since Rebecca had arrived. "Margaret chose well. You have a generous heart." On the way back to New York City, Rebecca thought about everything she had discovered. Her whole life had been built on a foundation of love and sacrifice she had never imagined. Margaret had loved her just as much as she loved Grace, even while carrying the pain of separation. When she got to the bakery, she found Dorothy waiting with a mysterious smile. "How was the meeting with your mother?" Rebecca told Dorothy everything, who listened carefully while preparing dinner for them both. "Are you going to keep visiting her?" "Every day, if I can. I want to make up for lost time." "And your brothers? Do they know where you are?" "I haven't spoken to them since the day of the will." As if he had overheard the conversation, Rebecca's phone rang. It was Daniel. "Rebecca, where are you? We're worried." "I'm fine, Daniel. I'm taking care of my life. Look, I know the will was a surprise for all of us, but..." "A surprise? You knew Margaret was spending money taking care of someone, and you always treated me badly because of it." There was silence on the other end of the line. "How do you know that?" "Because I found out who that person was, Daniel. My birth mother, Margaret's sister." "Rebecca, we didn't know that. Didn't know she was my mother, or didn't know Margaret was keeping her in a retirement home because she's sick." "We didn't know she was your mother," Daniel admitted. "Mom just said it was a sister who needed medical care." "And yet you blamed me for the money being spent." Richard and Jennifer were worried about the inheritance. They thought Mom was being tricked by someone. "And none of you ever thought to ask Margaret directly?" "We tried, but she said it was her personal business." Rebecca sighed. Understanding her siblings' perspective didn't lessen her pain, but at least it explained some of their behavior. "Daniel, Margaret left me a letter. In it, she asked me to find my birth mother before November 15th. "Why? What's special about that date?" "That's when the doctors think she might lose her memory completely. Margaret wanted me to have the chance to know her while it was still possible." "Rebecca, come home. Let's talk about all this." "What home, Daniel? Richard already made it clear the apartment I lived in is his now." "That was a misunderstanding. We can work it out." "There's nothing to work out. I'm fine where I am." "Where are you?" "Somewhere I'm welcome." Rebecca hung up without further explanation. She felt she needed time to process everything before facing the Johnson family again. During the following days, she visited Grace religiously. Some days, her mother recognized her immediately. Other days, she had to introduce herself again. But regardless of Grace's condition, Rebecca felt every moment together was precious. It was during one of these visits that the nurse called her aside for a private conversation. "Rebecca, I need to talk to you about your mother's condition." "Is she getting worse?" "The disease is progressing faster than we expected. Her moments of clarity are becoming rarer. How much time does she have?" "It's hard to say. It could be a few weeks, a few months. But with each passing day, she remembers less." "And physically?" "Physically, she's stable. The disease is only affecting her mind." Rebecca felt a weight in her chest. She had found her mother only to lose her again, in a different way, but just as painful. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Keep visiting. Even when she doesn't remember you, your presence brings her comfort. And maybe you'd consider reaching out to other family members. Sometimes having more people around helps patients stay connected to reality." "Other family members?" "Yes. Grace often talks about a sister named Margaret. Even though she's passed, perhaps Margaret's children could visit. She might recognize them as family." The idea of asking the Johnson siblings for help was complicated, but Rebecca began to consider that it might be important for Grace to have contact with people who represented Margaret in some way. That night, she called Daniel. "Daniel, I need a favor." "Of course, Rebecca. What do you need?" "I want you, Richard, and Jennifer to come with me to visit my birth mother." "Visit? Why?" "Because she's sick, and she might recognize you as Margaret's family. It could bring her some comfort." "Rebecca, this is really strange. We don't even know this woman. She's Margaret's sister. Technically, she's your aunt." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Where is she?" "At a retirement home in Montauk. She has dementia, and her moments of clarity are getting rarer. Richard and Jennifer will resist the idea. Then convince them. For Margaret, for her memory. Grace was Margaret's sister longer than she was her enemy. Let me talk to them, and I'll get back to you." 2 days later, Daniel called back. "I spoke with Richard and Jennifer. They agreed to go, but they have conditions." What conditions? They want you to come home afterward. They want to settle the inheritance more fairly. They want to give me something. They want to split the apartment. You can keep living there, and when you decide to sell, you'll split the proceeds with Richard. Why the change of heart? Because they're starting to understand Mom had her reasons for doing things the way she did, and because they feel they were unfair to you. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, Rebecca fell silent, processing the offer. Part of her wanted to accept, but another part felt it might be too soon to return. I'll think about the offer, but regardless of my decision, will you visit Grace? We will, whenever you want. Tomorrow afternoon, let's meet at the entrance of the retirement home at 2. The next day, Rebecca arrived at the retirement home a few minutes before her siblings. When she saw them approaching, she felt a mix of nervousness and hope. Richard was more serious than usual. Jennifer seemed uncomfortable, but Daniel smiled when he saw her. "How is she today?" Daniel asked. "She's having a bad day. She didn't recognize me when I arrived, but the nurse said she woke up talking about Margaret." "What was she saying?" "She kept asking when Margaret would visit her. They found Grace in the garden, but this time she was visibly confused, looking around as if searching for someone." "Grace," Rebecca said softly, "I brought some people to meet you." Grace looked at the four of them, and her eyes fixed on Daniel. You remind me of someone," she said weakly. "My name is Daniel. I'm Margaret's son." "Margaret?" Grace's face lit up. "Where is Margaret? She promised she'd come see me today." Richard and Jennifer exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel knelt beside Grace's chair. "Margaret couldn't come today, but she sent us to keep you company." "Are you Margaret's children?" Grace asked, looking at each of them. "Yes, we are. She always talked about you when we were kids, said she wanted lots of children to fill the house with laughter." Jennifer, who had kept her distance until then, stepped closer. "Did you know our mother when she was a child?" "I did. We were sisters. Best friends, too. We shared everything, played together every day." Grace smiled at the memory. "Margaret was more responsible than me. Always looked after me when I got into trouble. And after, did you stay close?" Grace's smile faded. After something happened. I don't remember well. I think we fought. It was very sad." Richard, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Our mother was always a good person. If you fought, I'm sure she wanted to make amends." "Do you think so?" Grace asked, hope in her voice. "I'm certain," said Daniel. "She liked to fix things, to keep the family together." "Family is important," Grace said, looking at Rebecca. "This young lady reminds me of someone very special, but I can't remember who." Rebecca felt her heart tighten, but Daniel quickly intervened. "It's because she's part of our family too. Margaret raised her like her own." "Oh, so you're siblings. How lovely." Margaret always wanted a big, close family. For the next hour, the four of them shared stories about Margaret with Grace, who listened with attention and joy. It was as if, through them, she could reconnect with the sister she'd lost so long ago. When it was time to leave, Grace held each of their hands. "Promise you'll come back. I like you all very much. You remind me of good things." "We promise," said Jennifer, and for the first time, Rebecca saw her emotional. Outside the retirement home, the four stood in silence for a few minutes. "She's a sweet person," Jennifer finally said. "It's hard to imagine she and Mom had such a serious fight." "Good people sometimes make bad decisions," said Richard. "What matters is that Mom never gave up on her and took care of her until the end, even without Grace knowing," Daniel added. Rebecca looked at the three siblings and felt something had changed between them. "Thank you for coming. I know it wasn't easy." "Rebecca," Richard said, "can we talk about that proposal?" "What proposal?" "About you coming home. About settling the inheritance more fairly." "Can I ask why you changed your minds?" Jennifer took a deep breath before answering. "Because seeing Grace there, we understood better what Mom was doing. She was taking care of family, and family takes care of each other. And your family too, said Richard, whether you're adopted or not. And seeing how you cared for Grace even when she didn't remember you shows the kind of person you are, Daniel finished. Rebecca felt her eyes fill with tears. Are you sure about this? Because if it's just pity... It's not pity, said Jennifer. It's justice. Mom left you that letter because she knew you'd do the right thing, and that's exactly what you did. So you really want me to come back? We want you to come home, said Richard, and we want to keep visiting Grace. She's our aunt, even if we never knew her before. And can I keep taking care of her? Of course, said Daniel. Actually, it would be great if you could teach us how to handle her condition. We've never lived with someone who has dementia. At that moment, Rebecca felt she had finally found not only her birth mother, but also her true family. The Johnson siblings weren't perfect, but they were willing to learn and grow. All right, she said finally. I'll come home, but on one condition. What? I want to turn part of the apartment into a space where I can welcome others going through situations like mine, people who need support to find their families or deal with adoption issues. The three siblings exchanged glances. That's an interesting idea, said Richard. But do you have experience with this? No, but I can learn. And can I count on your help? You can, said Jennifer. In fact, I can help with the legal side. I work in family law. And I can help with the medical part, said Daniel, who was a doctor. Many of these situations involve mental health issues, and I can help with the finances, said Richard. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. A week later, Rebecca was back at the apartment on Maple Street. At first it felt strange, like she was a guest in her own home, but little by little the sense of belonging returned. She kept visiting Grace every day, now always accompanied by at least one of her siblings. It was touching to see how each of them developed a special bond with her. Richard, the most pragmatic, always brought fruit and made sure she was eating well. Jennifer told childhood stories about mischief she'd gotten into, which always made Grace smile. Daniel, with his medical background, spoke to the retirement home staff to better understand Grace's condition and how they could help. During one of these visits, the head nurse called Rebecca aside. Rebecca, I have news. I don't know if it's good or bad. What happened? Grace is asking to speak to someone about a will. A will? Does she have assets to leave? Apparently, yes. She doesn't have much, but she has something. And in her lucid moments, she insists on getting everything in order. She wants to make a will. Yes. And she's specifically asking for you to be present when the attorney comes. When will that be? Tomorrow afternoon. The attorney has already been contacted and confirmed. Rebecca left the retirement home deep in thought. Grace had never mentioned anything about assets or inheritance in their conversations. What could she possibly have? The next day, she arrived at the retirement home with Daniel, who insisted on coming for moral support. They found Grace more lucid than she'd been in days, sitting in her room's armchair wearing a light blue dress that made her look younger. Rebecca, Grace said when she saw her enter. You came, and you brought Margaret's son too. Yes, I did. How are you feeling today? Better. Sometimes my mind clears up, like clouds moving away from the sun. Grace smiled. Today is one of those days. The attorney arrived promptly at 2. He was a young, serious-looking man who patiently explained the legal procedures. Mrs. Grace, are you sure you want to do this today? We can wait until you're feeling better. Attorney, I know my mind is failing. Today I'm well. Tomorrow I don't know how I'll be. I need to do this now. Very well. Could you tell me what your assets are? Grace took a deep breath before answering. I have a house in New Haven. It's small, but it's mine. I inherited it from my parents many years ago and never sold it. Rebecca and Daniel exchanged surprised glances. Grace owned a house. Is there anything else? I have some savings in the bank. It's not much, but I've saved it over the years from working. And who would you like to leave these assets to? Grace looked directly at Rebecca. I want to leave everything to my daughter, Rebecca Johnson. Mrs. Grace, the attorney interjected, I need to confirm parentage. Is Miss Rebecca your biological daughter? Yes. I gave her up for adoption when she was a baby, but she is my daughter. Rebecca, do you have any documents that prove this? Rebecca looked at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. I have a birth certificate stating that I'm the daughter of Grace Wilson. Perfect, then we can proceed. Over the next hour, the attorney prepared all the paperwork. Grace was determined and lucid, answering every question clearly. There's one more thing, Grace said when the will was almost ready. In the house in New Haven in the attic, there's a box with letters. They're letters I wrote to Margaret over the years, but I never had the courage to send them. Letters? After I gave you to her, I wrote letters asking for forgiveness, telling her about my life, asking about you. I wrote hundreds of letters over 30 years, but I never sent a single one. Rebecca felt her eyes fill with tears. Why didn't you ever send them? Pride, fear, shame. I thought Margaret was better off without me in her life. Grace, Daniel said softly, our mother also wrote letters. What do you mean? We found a box in her room after she passed away. Letters addressed to you, which she also never sent. Grace covered her face with her hands and wept. We were both so stubborn. We lost so many years because of pride. But now you two are at peace, Rebecca said, holding her mother's hand. Margaret took care of you in your final years, and you're leaving a legacy of love. I want you to read my letters, Rebecca, and I want you to read Margaret's letters too, so you understand that, even apart, we never stopped loving each other. When the will was finalized and signed, Grace looked exhausted but at peace. Now I can rest, she said. I know I've put my affairs in order. Mom, you're not going anywhere. We'll keep visiting. We'll take care of you. I know, dear. But my mind gets more confused every day. Soon I might not remember you or Margaret or anything. Even if you don't remember, we'll be here. That makes me happy. That night, Rebecca told Richard and Jennifer about the will and the letters. The four of them decided they would go to New Haven together that weekend to retrieve Grace's letters and bring Margaret's. It'll be like a posthumous reconciliation, Jennifer said. Margaret would be happy to know the story of the two sisters finally had a happy ending, Richard added. On Saturday morning, the four took Richard's car and drove to New Haven. Grace's house was on a quiet street, small but well kept. Rebecca used the key the attorney had given her and opened the door for the first time. The house was clean and tidy, as if Grace had only stepped out for a few days. In the living room, there were photos of a young Grace, and in one of them, she stood next to Margaret, both smiling, embracing, clearly very close. Look at this, Daniel said, picking up the photo. They really looked so much alike. And so close, Jennifer said. You can tell by the way they're hugging. They went up to the attic and found the box Grace had mentioned. It was an old shoebox filled with letters in yellowed envelopes. There were hundreds of them, organized by date. Rebecca picked up the first letter from 1993, a few months after she had given her daughter to Margaret. My dear sister Margaret, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to tell you that I regret our fight every single day. Are you taking good care of our Rebecca? Is she growing up healthy? I love her more than I ever managed to show, and I know you love her too. Maybe one day I'll find the courage to send this letter. Grace. Richard picked up a letter from 2010. Margaret, I heard Rebecca graduated as a nurse. I'm sure you must be very proud. I am too, even from afar. Does she ever think of me? Do you tell her that her birth mother loves her? Grace. Jennifer read one from 2018. Sister, I'm getting sick. My memory is failing, and I'm afraid I'll forget our daughter's face. I wish I could see you one last time, to ask for forgiveness in person, but my pride still holds me back. I've always been prouder than wise. Grace. Daniel found the last letter from 2023. Margaret, if you're reading this, it's because I finally found the courage to look for you, or because something happened to me. I want you to know you were the best mother Rebecca could have had. Thank you for taking care of our daughter when I couldn't. Thank you for being the sister I never managed to be. I love you forever. Grace. Everyone had tears in their eyes when they finished reading the letters. It was impossible not to be moved by the pain and love that shone through every word. "Let's go get Margaret's letters and bring them here," said Rebecca. "Let's put them all together, as they should have been from the start." They returned to New York City and retrieved the box of letters Margaret had left. Back at Grace's house, they organized all the letters by date, alternating Margaret's with Grace's. The unsent correspondence revealed two women who loved each other deeply, but were kept apart by pride and a situation neither knew how to resolve. Margaret wrote about Rebecca, about how she was growing up, her first steps, first words, first day of school. Grace wrote about longing, regret, and the love she felt for her daughter and sister. "It's like they kept a conversation going all these years," said Rebecca. "Just a silent one." "Mom truly loved Grace," said Richard. "All her letters talk about reconciliation, about forgiveness. And Grace loved Mom too," said Jennifer. "And she loved you, Rebecca. Every letter speaks of you with such tenderness." "Let's take these letters to Grace," said Daniel. "Even if she doesn't fully understand, maybe it'll bring her some comfort." On Sunday, they returned to the retirement home with some of the letters. Grace was having a difficult day. At first, she didn't recognize any of them. But when Rebecca began reading one of Margaret's letters aloud, something shifted in her eyes. "Margaret wrote this?" Grace asked, suddenly more alert. "Yes, she wrote to you regularly, but she never sent the letters either." "Please read more." Rebecca read several letters, both from Margaret and Grace. With each one, Grace seemed to grow more lucid, as if the sister's words were bringing back her memory. "We were two fools," Grace said when Rebecca finished. "Two proud fools who lost 30 years together over a silly fight. But you never stopped loving each other," said Rebecca. "Never. Not even for a day. And Margaret took care of you these past years, even when you didn't know it. She was always better than me. Kinder, braver. You're brave too. She gave me up for adoption because she knew it was best for me. I don't know if it was courage or cowardice." "It was love," said Daniel. "The same kind of love our mother showed you too your whole lives." Grace held Rebecca's hand and looked into her eyes. "Can you forgive me for abandoning you, for fighting with Margaret, for wasting so much time?" "I've already forgiven everything, Mum, and Margaret forgave you too. The love you both showed me shaped me into the person I am today." Then maybe our story was worth it after all. Over the following weeks, the four of them continued visiting Grace regularly. Her moments of clarity became rarer, but whenever she was alert, she asked to hear the letters. It was as if Margaret's words brought peace to her troubled mind. One December afternoon, the nurse called Rebecca at work. "Rebecca, I think you should come. Grace isn't doing well." Rebecca arrived at the retirement home with her 3 siblings. They found Grace lying in bed, very weak but conscious. "You came," she said with a faint smile. "My whole family together." "How are you feeling?" Rebecca asked, holding her mother's hand. "Tired, my dear. Very tired. Do you want us to read some letters?" "No need. I know Margaret's words by heart, and I know what I wrote to her too." Grace looked at each of them. "Thank you for taking care of me. Thank you for giving me the chance to know you." "We're the ones who should thank you," said Richard. "You taught us so much about forgiveness and family." "Family isn't just blood," Grace said. "Family is a choice. It's care. It's love." "That's true," said Jennifer. "Rebecca," Grace said, squeezing her daughter's hand. "You'll be okay. You have a family who loves you and you're strong enough to face anything." "I know, Mom." "And you 3, she looked at the Johnson siblings. "Take care of her. She's special." "We will," Daniel promised. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Can I confess something?" "Of course." "These past few months I sometimes dreamed Margaret came to visit me. She'd sit in that chair in the corner and we'd talk like we did when we were children." "What did you talk about?" Rebecca asked. "About you. About how proud she was of the woman you'd become. About how I should have looked for you both sooner. Were they beautiful dreams? The most beautiful of my life." Grace fell asleep holding Rebecca's hand, surrounded by the family she had found in the final moments of her life. She passed quietly in the early hours, leaving behind a legacy of love and reconciliation, The funeral was simple, but filled with love. Besides the 4 siblings, Dorothy from the bakery, Mrs. Mabel, Eleanor, and some staff from the retirement home who had grown fond of Grace were there. During the ceremony, Rebecca read one of the letters Grace had written to Margaret, and Daniel read a letter Margaret had written to Grace. It was as if the 2 sisters were finally having the conversation they should have had 30 years earlier. "They're together now," Mrs. Mabel said, wiping her tears. "Finally at peace. And we're still here, carrying their love with us," Rebecca said. 2 months later, the 4 siblings were at Grace's house in New Haven, transforming it into what they had decided to call Margaret and Grace House, Family Support Center. The project had grown beyond what they'd first imagined. Jennifer had secured volunteer legal support from fellow attorneys. Daniel arranged partnerships with psychologists and social workers. Richard organized the finances and secured donations, and Rebecca completed family mediation courses. "Do you think they'd be proud?" asked Rebecca, looking at the portrait of young Margaret and Grace that they had framed and placed at the entrance of the house. "I'm sure," said Richard. "They always wanted families to stay together." "And that's exactly what they achieved with us," said Jennifer. "Through the pain, they taught us about forgiveness," added Daniel. The first family to be helped at the house was a single mother who had given up her son for adoption 20 years earlier and now wanted to find him. Rebecca welcomed her in the same room where she had first read Grace and Margaret's letters. "I know exactly how you're feeling," said Rebecca, offering her tea, "and I can assure you, it's never too late for love." 6 months after the house opened, Rebecca received an unexpected call. It was a man who said he had information about Richard Carter, the man who had been the love of Grace and Margaret's lives. "My name is Paul Carter. Richard was my father." Rebecca felt her heart race. "Is your father still alive?" "No, he passed away 5 years ago, but before he left, he told me about 2 sisters he had met in New Haven. One of them had gotten pregnant by him. Do you know why he left?" "I do. He found out both sisters were in love with him and didn't want to tear the family apart. He thought leaving would help them reconcile." "Did he know Grace was pregnant?" "He found out years later when he tried to return to New Haven, but when he got there, he learned Grace had left and Margaret had married. He thought it was best not to stir things up." "Did your father ever marry?" "Yes, to me and my sister. But he always spoke of the 2 sisters from New Haven. He said they were the truest love of his life." Rebecca told Paul the whole story of Margaret and Grace, the unsent letters, the late reconciliation, the house that now helped other families. "My father would have been moved to know that his love, though painful at first, ended up creating something so beautiful," said Paul. "Would you like to visit the house?" "Very much. And I have some letters my father wrote to the 2 sisters. He never had the courage to send them either." When Paul visited the Margaret and Grace house, he brought Richard's letters with him. They were letters of regret, love, and explanation for his sudden departure. In them, he wrote that he had realized he was coming between 2 sisters, and that was the last thing he ever wanted. "Did he love them both?" asked Rebecca. "He did, in different ways, but he loved them, and he suffered his whole life for having caused their separation. But in the end, the love of all 3 turned into something greater," said Rebecca, looking around the house full of reunited families. "Margaret taught me about unconditional care, Grace taught me about forgiveness, and Richard, without even knowing it, taught me about sacrifice. That's a beautiful way to see things. It's the only way that makes sense." A year after the house opened, Rebecca was organizing a party to celebrate the 50 families reunited through the project when Dorothy arrived with special news. "Rebecca, there's a surprise for you outside." On the porch, Rebecca found a woman around 40 years old with a girl about 10. "Are you Rebecca Johnson?" asked the woman. "Yes, I am." "My name is Sarah, and this is my daughter Julie. We heard about your work here and wanted to meet you. Are you going through a family situation?" "Actually, no. We came to thank you." "Thank us." Sarah smiled and held her daughter's hand. Julie was adopted as a baby. She always knew and never wanted to find her birth mother. But when she heard Margaret and Grace's story, she changed her mind. "And did you find her birth mother?" "We did. And we discovered she had a story very similar to Grace's. She had given Julie up for adoption because she was alone and couldn't provide, but she never stopped loving her daughter." "And did everything work out?" "Better than we imagined. Now Julie has two mothers, and I have a very special friend." Julie, who had been shy until then, moved closer to Rebecca. "Aunt Rebecca, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Do you feel sad that your mother left?" Rebecca knelt down to be at the girl's level. "Sometimes I do feel a little sad, yes. But mostly I feel happy." "Why?" "Because she taught me that love is stronger than sadness, and that when we truly love someone, we always find a way to stay together, even if it's different from what we expected." "Do you think she's happy now?" "I'm sure she is. She's with Margaret, and they're both watching all the families reuniting because of their story." Julie smiled and hugged Rebecca. "When I grow up, I want to help families too. You're already helping, just by being here." That night, after everyone had left, Rebecca stayed alone on the house's porch, looking at the stars. Daniel came with 2 coffees and sat beside her. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking that Margaret and Grace achieved their dream." "What dream?" "Keeping families together." "Families. Look what their story has become." "It's true, and look what you've become because of their story." "What have I become?" "A bridge. Someone who helps others find their way back home." "I think we all have a little bit of bridge in us, don't we?" "Margaret was a bridge between me and family love. Grace was a bridge between me and forgiveness. And now I'm being a bridge between others and their families. It's a beautiful way to live. It's the way they taught me." 2 years later, the Margaret and Grace House had become a national reference for family reunification. Rebecca received invitations to give talks all over the country, always carrying the letters of the 2 sisters as proof that love always finds a way. It was during one of these talks in Chicago that she met Dr. Frank, a psychologist specializing in family therapy who was interested in the house's work. "I've never seen a project with such consistent results," Frank said after the talk. "You have an impressive success rate." "I think it's because we work with real love," Rebecca replied. "When people feel truly welcomed, they open themselves to possibilities." "I'd love to visit the house. Could I come by?" "Of course. We always welcome those who want to help." Frank visited the house the following month and spent a week observing the work. On the last day, he asked to speak with Rebecca. "I have a proposal for you." "What kind of proposal?" "I want to help expand the project. I have contacts at universities, government agencies, and foundations that could support creating more houses across the country." "That would be amazing, but I'm not sure we're ready for something so big." "You're more ready than you think. What you've done here is a model that can be replicated anywhere." Rebecca took a moment to consider the responsibility this would entail. "Can I talk to my siblings?" "Of course." "And Rebecca, can I say something personal?" "Go ahead." "I really admire your courage. Turning pain into healing isn't something just anyone can do. I had good teachers. Margaret taught me to persevere. Grace taught me to forgive. And you're teaching others to hope." That night, Rebecca spoke with Richard, Jennifer, and Daniel about Frank's proposal. "It's an incredible opportunity," Jennifer said. "Imagine how many families we could help. But it's also a huge responsibility," Richard pointed out. "We would need a much larger structure. And we'd have to ensure the quality of care doesn't change," Daniel added. "What do you think, Rebecca?" Richard asked. "I think Margaret and Grace would approve. They always wanted their love to reach as many people as possible." "Then let's move forward," Jennifer said, "but slowly, making sure each new home is built with the same care as the first." Over the next year, with Dr. Frank's help, they opened 3 new homes, one in Chicago, one in Philadelphia, and one in Denver. Each followed the original model, but was adapted to local characteristics. Rebecca traveled constantly to oversee the new projects, but always returned to New Haven, which she considered her true home. On one of these return trips, she found a letter on the entry table of the original house. There was no sender, just her name handwritten on the envelope. Inside was a photo and a letter. The photo showed a white-haired woman beside a man the same age, both smiling in front of a simple house. The letter read, "Dear Rebecca, my name is Rose and this is my husband John. We've been married 50 years, but 20 years ago, we lost contact with our daughter over a foolish family fight. We heard about your work and want to ask for help. We don't know how to start looking for her, but we know we don't want to leave this world without making peace. Can we arrange a talk? Rose and John Smith." Rebecca placed the letter and photo in the special drawer where she kept all requests for help. The next day, she would call Rose and John to schedule a meeting, another family that needed to find their way back to love. Before closing the house that night, Rebecca paused in front of the portrait of Margaret and Grace. Another family, mothers, another love story needing healing. As she always did before leaving, she gently touched the portrait frame. "Thank you for teaching me that love always finds a way. Thank you for turning your pain into hope for so many." Outside, the moon lit the garden of the house that had become a symbol of reconciliation. Somewhere in the country, families were reuniting, people were forgiving, and love was overcoming pride and resentment. The story of Margaret and Grace had become thousands of other stories, each unique but all connected by the same golden thread, the certainty that true love never gives up. And Rebecca, the daughter who had received only a yellowed letter in a will, now carried in her hands the responsibility of delivering letters of hope to families across the country. Margaret's letter had truly been more valuable than any material inheritance. It had been the key that opened the door to a life dedicated to love and reunification. That night, as she drove back to her apartment in New York City, Rebecca thought Margaret had been very wise to leave her only a letter. Any other inheritance would have faded with time, but the love in that letter had multiplied and would keep multiplying forever. And somewhere she was sure Margaret and Grace were together, watching the fruit of their late but true love blossom in every reunited family, in every forgiveness granted, in every new chance given to love. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this touching story and where you're watching from. If Rebecca's journey and the two sisters' story moved you, leave a comment sharing what stood out most. Do you believe love always finds a way to bring families together? I'd love to hear your honest thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to leave a like and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that will touch your heart.